12 hours. That is the window that separates the moment Iran publicly declared it would not stand down from its current military posture in the Strait of Hormuz from the moment that United States Air Force strike aircraft delivered a significant strike package against Iranian military infrastructure near Bandar Abbas, the strategic port city at the eastern mouth of the Strait of Hormuz that serves as the primary operational base for IRGC naval forces conducting anti-access operations against American and Allied shipping. The 12-hour gap between Iranian defiance and American military action is not a footnote. It is the most operationally significant 12 hours of this entire conflict, and the analytical question that everything I'm going to tell you today is designed to answer is this. What does the American decision to strike Bandar Abbas 12 hours after Iranian defiance reveal about American strategic decision-making in this conflict, and where does that decision take us in the hours and days ahead? The answers are not the ones that official framing will provide, and you need to hear them. Having spent years in military intelligence and having served in analytical roles where American strike planning decisions in the Persian Gulf region were the subject of ongoing professional attention, I can tell you that the American decision to execute a significant strike against Bandar Abbas after 12 hours of Iranian defiance is not a decision that emerged organically from military planning cycles. Strike packages of the scale and character that were employed near Bandar Abbas require planning, coordination, and target approval processes that operate on timelines measured in days rather than hours. The 12-hour gap between Iranian defiance and American strikes means that the strike package was not assembled in response to the Iranian statement. It was assembled before the Iranian statement and was awaiting a decision trigger rather than requiring additional planning time. The Iranian defiance was the political trigger that released a pre-planned strike package. Understanding that the American strike was pre-planned and pre-positioned tells you something very important about the American decision-making process in this conflict and about the relationship between military planning and political decision authority in the Trump administration's management of this crisis. Before we go any further, let me give you the specific details of what the American strike near Bandar Abbas actually struck and what the operational objective of the strike package was, because the target selection tells us more about American strategic goals in this conflict than any official statement has. Bandar Abbas is one of the most strategically significant locations in the Persian Gulf security environment. As the capital of Hormozgan province and the primary port facility for southern Iran, Bandar Abbas handles a substantial portion of Iranian commercial maritime trade. More importantly for the military analysis, Bandar Abbas Naval Station is the headquarters of the IRGC Navy, the branch of Iranian military forces that is specifically responsible for the maritime anti-access operations in the Strait of Hormuz that have created the operational constraints on American and Allied naval freedom of maneuver that I described in detail in earlier coverage. The IRGC Navy fast attack craft bases, the mini-submarine pens for the Gadir-class submarines that have been used for mine-laying operations in the approaches to the Strait, the command and control facilities for IRGC coastal defense missile batteries along the Hormuz shoreline, and the drone launch infrastructure for the IRGC's maritime surveillance and attack drone programs are all concentrated in and around the Bandar Abbas naval complex. The American strike package targeted what the Department of Defense will eventually characterize as IRGC military infrastructure, while attempting to maintain a targeting boundary that avoids commercial port facilities and civilian infrastructure in the Bandar Abbas urban area. Based on the strike profile derived from observable flight patterns of American B-1B Lancer bombers operating from Diego Garcia and F/A-18E Super Hornets from carrier-based operations in the northern Arabian Sea, the primary targets appear to have been the IRGC fast attack craft berths on the western side of the naval station, the command and control bunker complex that coordinates IRGC coastal defense operations along the Hormuz shoreline, and the fuel and ordnance storage facilities that support IRGC maritime operations in the Strait. Secondary targets appear to have included the radar systems on Keshem Island that provide over-the-horizon targeting data for Iranian anti-ship cruise missile batteries in the Strait approach corridors. Stay with me, because the Iranian response to the American strike near Bandar Abbas in the 6 hours following the attack represents the single most consequential development of this entire conflict cycle and has created a situation that is genuinely without precedent in American military engagement with Iranian forces. Iran did not respond to the American strike on Bandar Abbas with ballistic missile retaliation against American forces in the region. Iran responded with a single encrypted diplomatic communication through the Oman Channel, delivered to the American embassy in Muscat within 45 minutes of the first American bomb striking IRGC naval infrastructure, stating in precise operational terms that the IRGC had pre-targeted the Harad natural gas processing facility in Saudi Arabia, the Ras Tanura oil terminal in the Saudi eastern province, and the Jubail petrochemical complex with ballistic missile packages that would be launched if any additional American military action against Iranian territory occurred in the subsequent 72 hours. The communication identified the specific missile types, the pre-launch positioning of the firing units, and the approximate yield of damage to each target facility that the strike packages were designed to achieve. It was not a general threat. It was a specific, technically detailed operational warning designed to demonstrate that Iran had the precise targeting intelligence and the pre-positioned operational capability to execute the attacks described on a timeline shorter than American military response could prevent. What the mainstream media will not tell you is the full strategic significance of what that diplomatic communication achieved. Saudi Arabia, whose economy depends on the petroleum export infrastructure that Iran specifically threatened, received a private briefing from American intelligence within 90 minutes of the Iranian communication being received that conveyed the substance of the Iranian threat, the American assessment of its credibility, and the American decision to pause further strikes pending evaluation of whether additional military action would trigger the Iranian response described. The Saudi government's immediate private communication to Washington asking the United States to stand down from further strikes pending Saudi assessment of its own security situation is the most consequential communication in this crisis, because it represents the first moment in which a Gulf state ally has formally exercised its own security interests to constrain American military decision-making against Iran in a direct and explicit way. The Saudis are not acting irrationally. The Harad gas processing facility processes approximately 50% of Saudi Arabia's natural gas liquids production. The Ras Tanura oil terminal handles approximately 7 million barrels per day of Saudi crude oil exports at its peak capacity. The Jubail petrochemical complex is the anchor of Saudi Arabia's industrial diversification strategy under Vision 2030. Iranian ballistic missile strikes against all three of these facilities simultaneously would cause economic damage to Saudi Arabia that would dwarf any damage that continued American strikes against IRGC infrastructure at Bandar Abbas would inflict on Iran. The Saudi calculus is straightforward. The cost of asking the United States to pause strikes is zero. The cost of continued American strikes triggering Iranian retaliation against Saudi infrastructure is catastrophic. Saudi Arabia asked the United States to pause. The United States paused. Keep watching, because the operational situation that has now been created by the interaction of American strikes, Iranian deterrence communication, and Saudi constraint of further American action is one whose instability creates risk of escalation from unexpected directions over the next several days. The current situation involves American strike aircraft that have executed one strike package and are configured for follow-on strikes that have now been placed on hold at Saudi request. Iranian ballistic missile units that are in pre-launch positioning against Saudi and potentially other Gulf infrastructure targets, requiring either launch or return to garrison, with the tactical risk that accompanies returning pre-fueled missiles to storage. Israeli forces that are watching the American restraint with the same analysis I described in the context of the STRIK response, and drawing their own conclusions about the conditions under which American military action against Iran will and will not occur. IRGC naval forces at Bandar Abbas that are managing battle damage from the American strike while simultaneously maintaining the Hormuz denial operation that initiated this specific escalation sequence. And Gulf Cooperation Council governments that are discovering in real time that the security architecture they have relied upon for decades involves decision dynamics that are more complex and more constrained than the simple image of American military power as a reliable deterrence guarantee implied. The specific danger that this confluence of factors creates is not primarily the danger of deliberate further escalation by any of the primary parties. All of the primary parties are now operating with strong incentives to avoid deliberate escalation that would trigger the responses they have been deterred from triggering. The specific danger is the danger of unintended escalation, of a military incident or misperception at the operational level that triggers a response before the diplomatic mechanisms that are now engaged have time to exercise their moderating function. A collision between American and IRGC naval vessels in the Hormuz approaches, an accidental Iranian ballistic missile launch attributed to preparation posture rather than deliberate intent, an Israeli strike on a target in Iran that was executed on a pre-approved strike plan. Without awareness of the current American restraint commitments, any of these events could trigger an escalation sequence that bypasses the deterrent structures that are currently holding the situation below its worst-case threshold. Managing those risks in an operational environment as complex and as emotionally and politically charged as the current Persian Gulf situation requires a level of real-time crisis communication between adversarial military establishments that is extremely difficult to maintain under current conditions. The decisions being made right now by CENTCOM, by the National Security Council, by Saudi defense officials, by Iranian Revolutionary Guard commanders managing their pre-positioned missile forces, and by Israeli Air Force planners assessing their strike options in the current environment, will collectively determine whether the 12-hour window between Iranian defiance and American strikes becomes the hinge point of a de-escalation sequence or the first act of a conflict that has now entered its most dangerous phase. I have given you the analytical framework. The indicators are visible. Watch carefully what happens in the next 24 to 72 hours, and you will understand the trajectory before the official communications are designed to tell you about it. The intelligence dimension of this situation requires specific attention because the quality of intelligence that all parties are working from right now is significantly degraded relative to pre-conflict baseline conditions, and that degradation creates its own risks that compound the direct military dangers I have described. American intelligence collection on Iranian military disposition and intentions has been under sustained IRGC electronic warfare pressure for weeks, with Iranian jamming and deception operations targeting American signals intelligence collection platforms that are the primary source of real-time tactical intelligence on IRGC force positioning. The pre-launch positioning of IRGC ballistic missile units that was described in the Iranian deterrence communication may have been assessed by American intelligence through collection that was subject to Iranian information operations designed to either overstate or understate the actual missile readiness, and American decision-makers cannot have full confidence that the threat assessment they received accurately reflects the actual state of Iranian missile readiness rather than an Iranian-shaped picture designed to produce the deterrence outcome that Iran has achieved. That uncertainty is itself a strategic resource in Iranian hands, because deterrence based on uncertain threat assessment is often more effective than deterrence based on perfectly characterized threats, since uncertain threats cannot be confidently dismissed as bluffs. Israeli intelligence assessment of the current situation, which Israeli military and political decision-makers are producing independently of the American intelligence picture based on Israeli national collection systems, may differ from the American assessment in ways that create dangerous divergence between Israeli and American decision-making. Israel has its own satellite reconnaissance capability, its own signals intelligence collection architecture, and its own human intelligence networks with coverage of Iranian military disposition. If the Israeli intelligence picture of Iranian ballistic missile pre-positioning produces a different assessment than the American picture, Israeli decision makers may be operating from a threat model that does not recognize the constraints that the Iranian deterrence communication has imposed on American decision making, leading to Israeli strike actions that operate without awareness of the Saudi pressure on American restraint and of the American decision to pause further strikes pending evaluation. That scenario, where Israeli and American decision making become decoupled in a crisis environment because of divergent intelligence pictures, is one of the highest risk failure modes in the current situation and is not one that official crisis management communications have adequately addressed. The economic ripple effects of the American strike on Bandar Abbas and the Iranian deterrence response have already begun to manifest in global commodity markets in ways that reflect the market's assessment of the probability distribution of outcomes that the current situation could produce. Crude oil futures have responded to the threat to Saudi infrastructure with price movements that reflect a tail risk premium for the scenario where Iranian strikes against Harad, Ras Tanura, and Jubail remove a significant fraction of Saudi export capacity from global markets for a period of weeks to months. The Strait of Hormuz closure premium is already embedded in energy market pricing from the earlier drone deployment, and the additional premium from the Iranian threat to Saudi infrastructure has created an energy price environment that is beginning to have visible macroeconomic consequences in the import-dependent economies of Europe and Asia, whose governments are now applying their own pressure to Washington and Tehran through diplomatic channels that add additional complexity to an already overwhelmingly complex crisis management environment. The American domestic political situation has evolved in the 12 hours since the Bandar Abbas strike in ways that create additional constraints on American decision-making going forward. Congressional leadership of both parties has been briefed on the strike and on the Iranian deterrence communication in secure facilities, and the congressional reaction divides along lines that reflect the fundamental tension in American strategic culture between the deterrence through strength school and the escalation management school of conflict management. The administration's decision to pause further strikes pending evaluation of the Saudi communication has been portrayed by the deterrence through strength camp as a capitulation to Iranian pressure that will invite further Iranian aggression and as a prudent de-escalation step by the escalation management camp that prevents a conflict from expanding to include Saudi infrastructure destruction that would be catastrophic for global energy markets and for American economic interests. The president is receiving both of those arguments simultaneously from advisors whose institutional interests align with their positions, and the decision he makes in the next 24 to 48 hours about whether to resume strikes, maintain the pause, or pursue a diplomatic framework that addresses the Hormuz denial situation will shape American political dynamics for the remainder of his term.